Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to pause and reflect on a book from the Old Testament. It's the very first book in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. And we have with us John Soden, professor of Old Testament at Lancaster Bible College from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with us to help walk us through this book, very important book that starts and opens up our canonical work of Scriptures. John, welcome.
Thank you, Herb. Glad to be here.
As we think through this book, the very first book of the Bible, and generally firsts of anything, sets the stage for what follows.
Absolutely.
What would you say is the major thrust of Genesis that kind of sets the stage for all that follows?
Right. And as you mentioned earlier, certainly it's a book of beginnings. I'd like to even go a little deeper than that. The book of Genesis is foundational. It's really foundational for what God is going to do throughout history. It's also foundational for the purpose of the nation, and it's foundational for the themes that we're going to see throughout the rest of Scripture, because it's going to lay the foundation for how we should really see what God is doing through the plan of history and Scripture.
So we got this opening book that's kind of setting the stage for all that follows. What's the historical setting for this book?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think we need to see the book of Genesis as foundational for the nation of Israel. In fact, I would see it as an apologetic for the nation as they're coming out of Egypt, so that we recognize the purpose that God has for the nation. So we begin with Genesis, where you've got God as the creator and the sovereign king of the universe, but immediately, of course, we know the fall, and we move into the issue of how is God going to bring about his resolution to the sin problem. And he chooses Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, which leads us to the nation of Israel. So the book of Genesis really is showing why the nation of Israel coming out of Egypt is significant for God's purpose and plan.
What would you say are the theological issues? Now, I know this is going to be a tough question because there's a lot in any book.
There is a lot.
But I'm going to ask, what would you say are the top three? The top three.
Top three theological issues. As we come to Genesis, like you say, it's foundational for theology. It's foundational for so many ways. So as we think about creation, the issue is the rule of God, and God is absolutely sovereign. If he's absolutely sovereign and king, then everybody must bow before him. He has the right to not only the land which he has created all of, but then to put Israel where they belong, and so on. So the sovereignty of God is huge as ruler, as king of the universe, therefore king of individuals, with the responsibility to respond to him in worship. So sovereignty is huge. A second theme that is really significant is sort of who is man, particularly made in the image of God, but then fallen because of sin. And how does this impact then the plan of God moving forward? If God created man really to represent him and rule, as God is creating man as his images, they're created to represent God and his rule. The fall of sin has messed that up in many ways. So there's the image is marred, and there's the distortion, but then there's also what's happening to the plan of God. And then, of course, is the movement of God to restore mankind. And so there's that redemption motif. And so we recognize within redemption the fact that God begins immediately with Adam and Eve in the garden and clothing them and providing hope. We also see then, as we move through judgment, really, that God is still giving hope in the midst of judgment as men walk with the Lord and as they are righteous before him. We come to Abram, and God chooses really the seed that we begin to see in Genesis 3:15 is now moving through the line of Abram and then Isaac and then Jacob as he moves into the nation of Israel. So that key of redemption is really significant as we begin to look ahead and see how God is going to deal with this problem of sin, which is challenging his authority as sovereign king.
So it sounds like if I were a preacher, I could actually hone in on those three themes and develop a series if I wanted. Seems possible.
You could. I would really encourage pastors who are going to be preaching through the book of Genesis to do a little bit of work in how narrative works.
Okay.
Because the book of Genesis is largely narrative. And narrative is not quite like preaching the epistles. So you don't want to just take a verse or take a short pericope, but you want to see how the narrative is flowing.
Yeah.
And the narrative is developing the theology. So as you read through the stories of Genesis, it's not just story, but it's really theology. It's theological narrative, which is teaching about God, because Genesis 1 is not just a story about how God created, it's a story about the God who created, and it's teaching us his sovereignty, it's teaching us his power, it's teaching his authority over creation. When we come to Abram and we think about God moving into the life of Abram, it's not just stories about what Abram did, but it's teaching us the theology of what God is doing. And so understanding narrative is going to be very helpful. And then, as you understand the narrative, then preaching those narrative sections will help to develop that. This is really huge for our culture and our society, because we're so into narrative and story. And that's what Genesis is. It gives us just tremendous insight into God, but it's through the vehicle of story, of narrative, which helps us understand it in a different sort of way. But it's also a different sort of preaching. And I think it's really nice to do some topical things and say, well, this is redemption and this is fall, but it's really helpful to do it within the context of story so that you see what that means and what it really does.
Okay, so your encouragement is work your way through the narrative as opposed to doing it thematically.
I would
Okay.
really, but you can do it, and in fact you can do it in a number of different ways.
Right.
You can do the broad themes and take some broad strokes, but you're going to have to summarize for your congregation to help them understand that flow of story.
Right.
You can do it in some confined series. You could do a series on just the first 4 chapters or the first 11 chapters. You could do a series on the stories of Abraham. And you could take some of these sub-themes within the context of the larger themes and develop them through the storyline.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of sources out there for pastors. I know you've written one on, in the beginning, we misunderstood, and particularly focusing on the interpretation of Genesis 1. That's an extreme helpful source that we might look at. Are there other sources that might kind of lend some support for me as a pastor? If I'm a pastor and I want to do a nice series on Genesis, what works might you recommend that might give me some background, like your book for We Misunderstood?
Right.
Versus narrative type
Sure.
guidance
Sure.
for preaching and teaching Genesis. What would you suggest?
Sure. There's some really helpful works out there. For narrative itself, there are actually some books on preaching and teaching narrative, but just for understanding narrative, I would probably start with a couple of books, Adele Berlin, The Poetics and Interpretation of Biblical Narrative, and then Robert Alter is also The Art of Biblical Narrative. Both of those are very helpful just in understanding. They both give good examples and walk you through passages to help you see how the narrator develops the message and not just telling a story. And then I think probably the first book I would buy, just if I was going to be preaching through the book of Genesis, would be Alan Ross's Creation and Blessing. It's just, I think he's laid it out so nicely for pastors to give some of those major themes, to show how the passage develops, and give you some ideas for how to exposit it. I think that's just very helpful work.
Good. Well, John, thank you so much for sharing with us and giving some insights to the book of Genesis. And thank you for joining with us and listening in. By the way, feel free to pick up John's book on how in the beginning we misunderstood. And I trust that this has been a helpful video in thinking through how I might preach the book or teach the book of Genesis. In the meantime, I trust that you will have a great day and that you will walk with the King and be a blessing. Thank you.